Hey guys, hope you are doing well. Thanks for joining in on yet another video here this week. In today's video, we're going to be talking about the 4 mistakes that you want to avoid within your radio control car's gearing. Now, without any further delays, let's just jump right into the topic for today. Now, the first point that we have talks about the more obvious item of the 4 that we have today, and that is about the pitch of the gear that's within your car. Now, what you want to do if you're picking a specific pinion gear to mesh with the spur gear within your transmission, you want to make sure that both of those gears is going to have a near perfect mesh. And the way that you do that is by selecting the gear that has the same pitch value. Now, just to make things more confusing for you, there are 2 different systems that are used within the standards for gearing. One is known as the Imperial standard, and that deals with pitches that you might be familiar with, such as 32 pitch or 48 pitch. And the other system that we have is the metric system, and that deals with pitches that are known as metric modules. And you can have, for example, a popular one being 0.8 metric mod or 1.0 metric mod. Now, a popular question that I do get is, can you actually mix and match each one of those systems' pitches so that they are made to work? And the very quick and easy answer for this is no. Each standard is set up so that it is able to work very effectively with its own gear pitch. It's not designed and intended to go outside of that range. The next popular question that I get more frequently is, can I use a 32 pitch gear with a metric mod 0.8? If you're not familiar with why that question would be asked, it's because both of those pitches are actually very close to one another. In fact, if you look at the pitch circle for both of those gears, they're within about 1% from each other. Now, the quick and easy answer to this as well is I would not recommend mixing and matching the different pitches. They were just not intended to work with one another. However, there are a lot of people who are successfully running a 32 pitch gear with a 0.8 metric mod and vice versa. The next question might be, well, what is the signs and symptoms of any problem that could happen between using these 2 different gear sets? There are 2 main areas where you may notice a subtle difference when using these pitches that are different from each other. And that might be from the noise that is created as these 2 gears are meshing with each other. The second item that you may notice is an increased amount of wear by having these 2 different pitches. Now, the wear that you may notice may take a very long time in order to develop, and it's very possible that the amount of wear that is exposed within your system could go without being noticed. Now, the second item that we have here today is to set your gear mesh correctly. Now, the reason why you want to set your gear mesh correctly is because you could end up developing some premature wear on those specific components. If you set your gear mesh too tight, you could be causing a bunch of binding. Now, the way that you'd be able to identify this is by the amount of noise that your gear train is going to be giving off. That gear train, when it's set too tightly, is going to start to whine. And what you may notice is increased amounts of heat within the gear train itself, or possibly even within the motor. Now, it does depend on how much power your motor is actually outputting for that specific system in order to be able to identify additional amounts of heat that is created just because of the frictional increases within your car. Now, as time goes on, and if this is not corrected, you can actually wear away the teeth of those gears to the point where it is going to reduce the amount of strength that it would otherwise have. And of course, what this is going to do for you is it's going to subject you to possible failure points within that gear set. So you want to make sure you're setting it correctly for that reason alone. And on the other side, the flip side of this is you want to make sure that your gearing is not going to be set too loose. If it is set too loose, you do run the risk of instantaneous failure. Now, there's not going to be much of a warning sign when your gearing is set too loose up to the point of failure. What you may notice is that there is more or increased amounts of backlash between the gears, and that's essentially the gear spacing between all of the teeth. So you can imagine if you have a meshing gear set, we're talking about this distance as each one of those gears is rotated. What you want to make sure here as well is that you're setting the gear mesh correctly to avoid this scenario as well as the previous scenario that we talked about. And this is a perfect segue into our third item for today. And that is going to be setting the gear mesh correctly, but also making sure that your fasteners are not going to come loose. So within radio controlled cars, I've had a ton of experience with this in the past, especially when I ran primarily nitro-powered vehicles, that my motor mount would end up shuffling and moving away, opening up the gap between my pinion gear and my spur gear. And what would happen from there is I have the potential to strip out the gears. Now, I don't see this too frequently happening today with the motor mount systems that we have for brushless power. That does not mean that we don't have the potential for this to happen. If you don't fasten your fasteners tight to the point where things cannot drift, you could see this happen to you. So what you want to make sure that you're doing is setting that mesh, but then making certain that those fasteners are tight. If you do notice that you constantly have to set your mesh because those screws are vibrating loose and then shuffling around, what you want to do is set your mesh again, but instead of just tightening up those fasteners, use some sort of thread lock on them so that they do not vibrate loose. My personal recommendation is to use a temporary thread locking component. The reason why I point out that you want to use a more temporary thread locking compound is because if you're anything like me, you will notice that within about 2 days, you will need to go faster. And here we are being Captain Obvious. If you cannot unlock those threads and unfasten the fasteners, you will not be able to switch out your pinion gear so that you can go faster after 2 days have passed. And lastly, the final point that we have to talk about today happens to deal with the gear ratio of your radio controlled car. What we want to make sure is that we don't overgear our radio controlled cars to the point that our power system is overheating. Now, the way that you'd be able to recognize that is by simply just measuring the heat of your brushless motor, your speed control, and your battery pack. You want to make certain that you're within the maximum limitations of those specific parameters, and that's going to be a maximum temperature limit. Once you have measured the temperature of all three of those components as a baseline with your current or stock gearing, and you know that you have enough headroom between the actual limit as well as where you're operating, this is when you can move up to that new gear set so that you can get more performance. Now, what you want to do is after you install that gearing, you want to do the same measurements. You want to measure the amount of heat that you get from that gear set. Now, the way that you do this is you'd want to decrease the interval of time so that you don't run into the risk of anything burning out. So if before you were measuring at the end of your run and that run happened to be 10 minutes long, this time try it out at 1 minute intervals. Run it really aggressively for 1 minute, come back and check the temperature and see what it's at. This way you'll be able to catch at any point if you do happen to run over that maximum thermal limitation. Well guys, that pretty well sums it up for this video, talking about the 4 mistakes with gearing that you want to avoid. As always, like the video if you do, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so that I can see you in that next video. Thanks a lot for watching, and I'll see you next Monday.